So thank you, James, for being with us, and thank to Penny to be here also. What is modeling, and how is it connected to your career?
Okay. Well, if you were to ask me what I am, effectively I am a modeler in that everything I do involves modeling. My qualification is, for the last 25 years is a psychotherapist, but I do my psychotherapy with a modeling process. I have also consult to organizations, and when I go into the organizations, I take my modeling hat in and I do my modeling in that. And as a teacher, for example, we teach our work to all around the world. One of the things that's interesting is if someone asks me a question, well, I will model that question in order to understand it. And it's just a different way of making sense and understanding the world. So I apply it all the time, and I even would apply it in my private life. So if I stop someone on the street and ask directions, I won't just listen to what they say, I will model how they are giving me directions to help me have a better understanding to not get lost. So it's everything I do is based on modeling.
What is what you call the NLP style modeling?
Okay, so I mean, in its broadest sense, modeling is very common. At some level, we all model all the time in that in order to understand language, where the words come in, and we have to make sense of them, and we build some kind of model of what the other person's talking about, and then we respond. So that's a kind of naturalistic modeling that you have to do in order to understand language. There's also more formal modeling, like mathematical modeling and computer modeling. There are all of those processes that are well documented. But the area that I'm really interested in is what goes on inside people. We can see their external behavior, but we all have an internal world, a world made up of thoughts, emotions, ways of thinking, perspectives. So an NLP style modeling is going, how do people do what they do inside? That means on the outside they can perform excellently. Because the belief is that it's a two-way thing. It's what you do on the outside, but also the inner game of tennis or what else has such a big influence as well. And that's for me, both the challenge and the excitement. How do you get to that information, most of which the person themselves is unconscious of, because they just do what they do. So that's what I would call NLP style modeling.
What are the purposes of modeling, and what are the companies that are using or have used modeling in the past on the major projects that they worked or even you worked on?
Okay. So the main way it's used is to, first of all, understand and to be able to build a model of an internal world of someone who is excellent. Then the second part then is, having done that, how does that information get used by other people? So in the talk later on, I will give I will go step by step through a modeling project. But in principle, that's how it's used in companies. So for example, they will find out how their top salespeople are outperforming anyone else and try to help their average salespeople to increase. And the interesting thing in my experience of working in organizations is actually a small increase in a person's way of approaching their job can actually result in large-scale productivity. So it's also used, though, it's being used, for example, in Liverpool John Moore University in England as a way for students to understand how they learn best. So let's take an example. A lecturer stands up, they've got 50 or 100 students. It's impossible for them to meet the learning style of all those students. So instead, what they're doing at Liverpool John Moore is they're turning it round and they're saying to the students, if you understand your learning style best, can you adapt it to the style of each lecturer so that you get most? You can't do that until you know the way that you prefer and the way you don't prefer. That's another way that's being used. It's also, I said it's the basis of coaching and psychotherapy because it's an interesting idea, this idea of excellence. When we think of excellence, we think of genius, we think of people who do wonderful things. But I'd like to broaden out the idea of what excellence is because it's my belief that everybody is excellent at being themselves. There's nobody else on the planet who can do them as well as they do them. Now, in terms of understanding how people do things well, that's fantastic, we can pass that on. But in a therapeutic or a coaching environment, understanding how you don't do things well can be really useful. So, isn't it interesting that people can consistently and repeatedly not achieve the things they want to achieve in their lives? That doesn't happen by accident. My belief that happens by an internal processes that is in some way getting in the way of them achieving their full potential, achieving the things that they want to achieve. And so, in some ways, they're doing that excellently because they're getting the same results over and over. So that's the first thing, so helping them to understand that. And then here's an interesting thing. One of the beliefs behind NLP that was so useful for me was all behavior is useful somewhere. So the question is, if a person is doing a certain behavior with a certain way of thinking and they're getting bad results, it's to go, where might that be useful? So let me give you an example. Penny and I worked with a pharmaceutical company, and one of the things they wanted to do is when they were doing clinical trials, one of the most difficult things for them was if the people on the clinical trials didn't take the medication, because it ruined the trials. So they wanted us to help find out how do people who are compliant with following the regime follow the regime compared to people who are not compliant and stop taking it halfway through. What's the difference that goes on between those two groups of people? And when we studied the people who were not compliant, it suddenly dawned on us that these people stopped taking drugs. Wouldn't that be useful for some people who are trying to stop being addicted to drugs they don't want to take? If we could use some of those strategies, maybe that could help them. So you get an example of an area where you've discovered one thing. Suddenly you find out, wow, that might be useful over here. So that's an example. Those are a couple of examples. I'm going to give us a few more examples in my talk. But does that give you a flavor of the kind of thing that where modeling is used?
Yes, definitely. What could you say to HR director or trainers that would like to improve the content of their training to be really powerful for their clients? How could they use modeling, and how could you talk a little more about, is it really possible to transfer excellence in a specific field?
Okay. I think it's core to this whole topic and a fascinating question. And I'll give you an example from some modeling that I didn't do, but that was done in America with part of the American Army. And they brought in some modelers to find out how did the people who were the best small arms sharpshooters, what were they doing that was different to the people who were only average or poor at using a gun, small arm, as they called it. And when they discovered the difference, they then looked at the training program, and one of the things they were able to do was to drop a large proportion of the training program because it actually was irrelevant to becoming good. The theory said you needed to do all these things, but actually if you just did what the people who were excellent sharpshooters did, your scores went up dramatically. And they were actually able to, and I can't remember the exact figures, but they were able to reduce the training period dramatically. So one of the things that modeling does is it finds out what's essential. Or as a phrase that I know you know, that we both like from the British polymath Gregory Bateson, what's the difference that makes the difference? What are excellent people doing that the rest of us are not? And if we can do some of that, that increases our performance. So that was the first part of your question. The second part then was, how do you do the transfer piece? And I have to say, that's the real challenging piece here. And in many ways, what I would say is it has to be tailored to what is the information that's trying to be acquired. So, for example, if you were trying to, you gave the analogy of learning to ride a bike. You don't learn a bike by reading a book. You learn a bike by getting on a book. So if you were going to transfer the skills of a physical skill, the best way to do it is physically. And the way that we specialize in doing is the use of metaphor. If you think about it, how does anybody acquire something they don't already understand? Well, one of the most common ways is they take ways they already know and they use that to find out how other things work. So this is what happens in education all the time. How does a solar system work? And how do atoms work? Well, we say, atoms are a bit like a solar system. Well, we know what a solar system is, therefore we can imagine what an atom is. You can't see an atom, but you can imagine it might work like a solar system. Electricity, you can't see electricity, but you can imagine it might work like water flowing through a pipe. So the way metaphor works is you take experiences that people have had in their everyday life, and you go, there is a correspondence with this other thing you don't know. So if you can help to find metaphors that make that link, then the transfer of the knowledge can occur. But it is an art, it's not a science. And part of the area that we bring in is then looking at the other side of the equation is, what does the person need to do to take on a different metaphor? We all have within us hundreds of metaphors that we use daily, mostly unconsciously, to make sense of the word. How do we add a new one? And here's the interesting thing, children have no problem with that. That's what children do. They just kind of take on the world, they take on metaphors from their pupil, from their teachers, from their colleagues, from their parents. But as we grow and our store of internal way of working grows and gets more and more fixed, so, as a general rule, it gets harder to add something new to that. But I think it's possible that we can open up our ways of learning to take on new metaphors. That's a whole big other subject.
You were talking about Gregory Bateson, and there is a field which is called systemic approaches. How do systemic approaches, how could they be included, or how do you include them in your modeling?
Okay, that's really interesting because in a way language is a very linear process. The words come out one at a time. But my knowledge is very analog, it's very systemic, it's all connected up. The neuroscientists tell us we've got all these interconnected networks. Then out comes my words and a few gestures. They go into your system, and somehow you have to turn this digital word by word back into your own systemic understanding. And one of the ways that we can do that is, interestingly enough, through metaphor. And the reason for that is metaphors operate at multiple levels. Same with stories, the same with art. And many of those levels are unconscious. We can acquire information at an unconscious level as well as just a cognitive level. And so if I say, it's very interesting, if I give an example. I was modeling not long ago a CEO of a software company, and he in particular wanted to find out how come he was so successful in a sales meeting And he wanted that because his new salespeople in the company couldn't do what he could do. But he didn't know how to tell them what he did. So here's part of his metaphor. Is when he walks into that sales meeting with the potential customer, it's like he is a special forces operator. And he goes into this room and there are minefields with mines all over the place. And his job is to detect those mines. And there are three kinds of mines. There are mines that can blow up, and then you're in real trouble. There are mines that you can disarm, and that's really important to the sales process. And there are mines that you're not sure, so you have to put a flag on them and try to sidestep them. Now, let's just take that as a simple idea. It never occurred to me that selling could be like that. If I sell in my own way, I sell ideas, you can say, but even if I was selling a product, I never would have thought of going into a room. But now if I do, if I was to walk into this room and I was trying to sell a product, and I thought there are mines, and I've got to identify those mines, and some of them can blow up, and I'm a special operator with all these skills, it changes my attitude to the selling process completely. The first thing I'm going to be paying attention to is safety. Because by definition, if mines can blow up, people get injured. So now, instead of thinking about selling, the most important thing to him when he walks into a room is safety. His safety and the safety of the client and the safety of the process. Now, isn't that an interesting idea? Just in of itself has already changed my way of thinking about sales. I don't know about anybody else in the room, but there's an example of taking one person who's very good at something, understanding just the beginnings of how they think metaphorically would change my attitude about the way I walk in, and my belief is it would change the way I behave. Even that little 2-minute example. That is the beginning of a transfer of expertise from him to me, to you.
So, I'm always interested in the scientific ground of modeling and the limit that we already talked about regarding what science can and cannot explain, because it's a very pragmatic way to intervene in companies. So could you tell us a little bit about your perspective on that?
Okay. Well, first of all, I think it's one of the tragedies of this field is that it's not well known enough, it's not well understood enough, that it's been scientifically tested enough. There are not many scientific studies of the efficacy of modeling. And there's historical reasons for that, which I won't go into. And I think there are people who are doing these studies, and I think there's a great opportunity. You're absolutely right. It's a practical approach, and my experience is that what companies want are the results. If they get the results, that's good enough for them. The scientific validation may be useful for them to listen to you in the first place, but by the end of the day, they want results. And my experience also, again, is that most companies and organizations are quite actually happy with a small increase in productivity, which can grow over time. So I remember a project that Penny and I did for a bank in central London. It was a niche bank operating for a very specialist market. And they asked us to do this project. And I won't go into the details of it, but what I will say is that we were doing the project and they said, look, we haven't heard anything from you. We're getting a bit worried. Can you write us, and can you give us an interim report? How far have you got? So we said, okay. So we wrote up an interim report of what we found, and they said, that's good enough. We don't want any more. Stop. We'll pay the invoice. That's plenty for us to work with. And so I think until you see those results, it's hard to believe it. But then you ask the question about the limits to scientific investigation. And I'm very interested in the new field of neurology. I mean, it is a relatively new field, the new developments of fMRI scanners and the beautiful pictures that they produce. And I'm also wary of making what Gregory Bateson would call a logical typing error, which is seeing pretty pictures and thinking we understand how people think. There is actually some really interesting scientific research that if you put the word neuro in front of anything, people feel it has more credibility. If you show them a pretty picture with nice graphics on it of a brain, people will believe the words that go with it, even when the words are complete and utter made up. It doesn't matter. The people's ability to distinguish goes down because of that. So I'm a little bit suspicious of those kind of things. And if you look at the scientists who are doing the research, they are much, much more conservative than the newspapers who go, breakthrough, the God spot has been discovered, the empathy spot has been discovered, or all the things that you read about in the newspaper. My experience is that actually when you go back to the hard science, what have they discovered? What does an fMRI measure? For a start, it measures blood flow. So it's not even measuring direct neuronal connectivity. Secondly, when you look at one of those things called a voxel, it's equivalent to a pixel on a two-dimensional image, how many neurons are in a voxel? Well, last time I looked, the best fMRI scanners could get down to 40,000 neurons. So when one voxel is activated, that's 40,000 neurons that are, some are on, some are off, some are doing whatever they do. That's the level of sophistication. It's massively changed in the last 10 or 20 years, but it's still a long, long way. Especially when we link it to your idea about systemic, because the ideas behind systemic is it's the interconnectedness that counts. And if there's one thing on the planet, in fact on the universe, that's more connected than anything else, the human brain. On average, it's 2.5 steps between any two neurons in the human brain. That's how connected it is. So you can go from one neuron, 1 step, 2 step, and you're probably at any other neuron, possibly 3, to get to any other neuron. That is the interconnected of the brain. And at the moment, there is no way of measuring, of seeing that interconnectedness, and especially the dynamic nature, the way it changes. There's no way of tracking that down at fine enough detail. One day there may be. So I'm cautious about how we can apply the latest findings. And what I would really cautious people is going from down at the neuron level to the behavioral level. There's only 150 levels in between that we've just jumped. And that worries me.
You talked about results and results in company. Could you please describe the different step of a modeling project through a case study that you've got in mind? Okay.
Well, let's take a very small one, which was the one I talked to you about, the CEO of the software company. The first stage is there needs to be some kind of preparation, and that preparation involves setting up some criteria for the person's excellence. It's great that the person says they're excellent, but I need a bit more hard evidence. So what is the evidence that this person gets consistently good results? In this case of this director who's attempting to move away from the sales, he doesn't want to do that anymore, his company's too big for him to do that, but he was the best performing salesperson the company's ever had. That sounds like good evidence to me, and they can measure his sales. So we take that as an example. The second stage then is the modeling of his internal process. We can model his external process, but actually that's easy. You just watch what he does and you see the way he moves and you see the words he uses. Relatively speaking, that's easy. So I spent the time with him helping to understand what's his attitude when he goes into the room, how does he deal with different types of salespeople, different scenarios. How does he know the process is finished? And for example, one of the things that shocked his other things, he says if he walks in and he can get the interest he wants in 10 minutes, that's it. He calls the meeting off. He finishes it in 10 minutes. And that, according to him, breaks all the salesperson rules because he hasn't gone all through all the steps. So there's an interesting thing. What's he noticing? That after 10 minutes, I've got enough interest from the customer, I can stop now. So the second stage is gathering the information. And the way they do that, primarily, there's two primary ways: to observe the person, and secondly, the way that we're going to demonstrate is through an interview. The third thing is to take the information and to find a structure that represents the internal organization of that individual, much of which they will not have known themselves, and much of which will come out in metaphor, and much of which was not available to me at the time because it's kind of embedded in the structure. So we take the transcript, we take the video, and we work through that, and we model out the structure. When you model out the structure, then you need to test whether, in fact, you've got anything that's useful. So you could do that by, I will attempt to sell. It's going to be a bit difficult for me to do that in this case because I know nothing about this software that he sells, and it's very technical. But I could apply it just in selling other things, or I could give it to other salespeople and we could test out theirs. In this case, he didn't want to do any of those. What he wanted was his new salespeople to try and take on this model. And what we're in the process of at the moment now is getting the data. Does it improve their results? So the end measure is not what they do. The end measure is what are their results compared to his results. And all this bit in the middle is the kind of black box that's trying to aim that if he has these results and they have these results, that at the end of this, their results may not be up here, but they're up there. And that's where at the moment, we're measuring that. We don't yet have enough time to do it. But in principle, those are the 5 stages of a modeling project. And you can sometimes do them in different order, but that's the general principle.
And you and Penny, you added a major brick to modeling, which is called Symbolic Modeling. We will talk further in a minute. What would be, in a couple of sentences, the descriptions that you might give about it?
Okay. Well, here's one of these interesting things where you model one person, you find out how they do that, and you go, wow, that could be interesting over here. So we modeled this very innovative psychotherapist called David Grove. He's a New Zealander, and he was working in a way with his clients in a way we had never seen before, we'd never heard about, and we were absolutely fascinated what we were doing. And he was working with people who had suffered severe trauma, either as a child, in their childhood, or as an adult, like Vietnam War veterans, or people who've had car accidents or things like that. And he was working to help them resolve those traumatic memories and experiences. So we studied with him and we modeled him. We had this idea it was going to take a year. It took us 4 years. He was a bit more complicated than we thought. But what happened when we got the structure of what he was doing is what we said is actually this is a much, much more useful process. It is in itself a modeling process. Because what he did was support his clients to find out about the metaphors they had for their traumas and the metaphors they had for how they would like to live their life, and to support them to change the traumatic ones and to live more in the empowered ones. But he didn't do it by telling them. He did it by a series of questions which got them to what we would now say self-model, discover for themselves and unpack it. He never told them anything, ever. It was entirely done through those kind of questions. And we go, this is where the idea was, those people are actually excellent at being themselves. They just don't like the results. What if we took that and started modeling people who did like the results and got really good results? And that's when we developed the field of symbolic modeling. And we called it that because it was based around metaphor, it was based around modeling, and then the core of it, which was the questioning process, which is called clean language, and I'll explain about that later. So in a nutshell, that's what symbolic modeling is.
It is systemic too.
I think so, yeah.
Okay. So you will start like a masterclass.
Okay, yeah.
Points, and then after that we will have a demonstration with our guest.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you for your attention. Thank you for coming along. And it's a pleasure for me to be here, to be invited by the alumni of such a prestigious organization. And I would say it's a pleasure for me to be here while we are still part of the European Union. I'm not sure how long that will survive. I hope for a very long time, but in the world of politics, you never know. So what I'm going to do is give you a brief overview of some of the things that we've just talked about here. And I understand that I don't have enough French to explain these ideas. I am fine if you need clarification over any of the points. Please ask me and see if I can clarify them, or perhaps someone will translate for you into French where there's an area of that. So to that now, all I've got to need. So all right, let me step out of the way. So this is me, James Lawley. This is what I'm going to talk about. And almost everything that I'm going to talk about includes Penny, because she's been involved, we've been involved together from the beginning of doing the modeling at David Grove and most of the other work. And we happen to be married as well. So that happened along the way. So we have quite a few relationships. So let me just give you some examples of some of the modeling I have done, okay? So the one at the bottom, Simon Coles, this was the modeling that I just talked about in detail. And although he wants it as a sales process, I think it's going to be really interesting as a negotiation process as well. The top one was David Grove. This was our big project, and in many ways we became master modelers through that 4-year process. And although it was entirely a therapeutic process, it's now used in business, and the place that it warms my heart the most is in education, not only at universities, but down now. There's some beautiful work being done down with children as young as 5 years old. And I can tell you, children love to work in metaphor. This one here, Martin Snowden, was a very, very interesting project. Martin Snowden is a peace worker. It's his full-time mission in life. Originally, he was on the other side of the fence. He was a convicted terrorist in Northern Ireland who served 18 years in Longcash prison. But his time in prison taught him that that was not the way, and he came out and dedicated the rest of his life to peace. Now, he does some very interesting work with trying to work not only in Northern Ireland, but in places like Nicaragua, in Haiti, in Kosovo, in all over the world that he's worked. And he often has to work with groups whose values he completely abhors. It started with his work in Northern Ireland, that he would have to work with some people from the other side of the sectarian divide, people who he knew had harmed his family. And he had to sit in the room with them and work and support them to have a peaceful approach. Equally, he's worked with drug lords in Haiti, whose drugs are causing terrible, terrible chaos to young people. But if he doesn't learn to work with them, So we modeled, how does he sit in a room with a person who's opposite him, whose values he abhors, and build a relationship, a long-term relationship? It was a very, very moving exercise, and when we discovered that, Penny and I have applied that to more generalized conflict resolution and also to the revolution of what happens in families. Because families can get, maybe none of you have ever had this experience, but families can get into such a war that they will stop talking to each other, they're estranged, and in a way it becomes like a microcosm of what's happening in Northern Ireland, in Israel and Palestine. And so we've applied it there. I won't go through all of these, I'll just talk to you about this one because this was a lot of fun. We studied with a man called Vivian Gladwell who teaches improvisation or clowning. Not the kind of pie-in-the-face clowning, but the kind of clowning where you put on a red nose and you just improvise. Fascinating kind of spontaneous way of clowning. And when we saw the way that he trained clowns, because how do you train people to do that? We realized we now apply it in coach development. We use the same approach to teaching coaches to be more spontaneous, to responding not to the audience, but to their clients, and to be to working with what's happening. It's very, very interesting. So here's just some examples of some modeling. NLP, just for those who, in case you've never heard of it, Neuro-Linguistic Programming, started in the mid-70s. These two guys, Richard Bandler and John Grinder, were part of a whole team. It wasn't just them, but they were the figureheads. And one definition I like is the study of the structure of subjective experience. If subjective experience didn't have a structure, we'd be wasting our time modeling. Because that's what we're looking. We're not looking for the individual way a person works. What we're looking is the organization of their inner world. And in fact, I don't think coaching and I don't think psychotherapy would be of any use if there weren't structures on the internal way that we work. And the other presupposition is that our language in some ways represents those internal structures. It's my experience. Actually, there's not really much scientific proof to it. It's beginning to get some now, but if it wasn't like that, can you imagine if the words people use didn't represent the internal world of them? How would we understand each other? I don't know. So, where did NLP come from? Well, here's a nice wheels within wheels. It came from modeling these four individuals. We've talked about Gregory Bateson, Milton Erickson, the world's foremost hypnotherapist, Virginia Satir, the founder of family systems therapy, Fritz Perls, the founder of Gestalt therapy, and going, what are these people doing? What makes each of them work in such different ways, but have such an effective ways of working with people who want to change their lives? Out of that came, so nobody set out to discover NLP, it came out of the modeling of those people. So I put this up as an example of what tends to happen and to make a difference between NLP style modeling and kind of standard investigations. And I just picked this one and I could have picked 10,000, but here's a project that was done by Harvard into the quality of arts education. They wanted to study what made good arts education. Fantastic project, they come up with lots of interesting results. Here is the summary of their results. They identify 4 areas. But what I want you to notice is the information, the way it's presented. So let's look at this word: engagement, ownership, authenticity, intentionality, flexibility, transparency, openness, collaboration, communication. That's all you have to do. Just do those and then you'll be brilliant at arts. That's it. No, I don't need to do any more. I've told you, here it is. The question is, how do you do authenticity? How do you do ownership? How do you do those things? And that's the question that NLP tries to answer. What is happening inside people when they are being authentic? When they do own their subject, when they do own their own internal responses. And all of these things, what's going on inside them? So this is a kind of traditional kind of project, and it produces useful information, but it always leaves the question, how do you do it? That's the question that NLP seeks to answer. So this is a little bit of a diagram that is the 5 stages of a modeling project that I talked about. Just to repeat it briefly, so there's obviously a preparation stage. This is the information stage. What does the exemplar, that's the name for the person you're modeling, what do they actually do? Get some examples of that. What do they say they do? That's through the interview. And then there's another piece in there which is their explanation for what they do. Mostly, that's useless. People explain what they do. They've got a lovely story about how they do what they do. It satisfies them. It satisfies lots of people. But mostly, it's not very relevant. What we're interested in is how do they do it, not why do they think they do it that way, mostly. So you gather this all information, you construct some model, you go out on the road and you test it. And there are whole ways of testing this. And you find out what results do you get when you try and test it. And that provides the feedback. It's an iterative process. You have to change your model. Maybe you go back and interview them again, and it goes round and round and round and round. Eventually you end up with something that's useful enough and simple enough that you're ready to offer it to other people. And then then you have to set up some methodologies that give them an opportunity to acquire. I think that learning happens by acquisition, not by transfer. And what you're testing, this is the bottom line, what they get compared to up here, what they got. That's what you're looking. Does this get nearer to that? If it doesn't, you failed. If it does, good. Whether, and here this is one of the things that makes modeling different to theory building, whether this is true, the model that you come out with, is irrelevant. The question is it useful? Does it help this person get better results? If it does, great. That's the primary basis of it. So, don't want to give you an idea there's just one thing called NLP style modeling. There are a whole number. And here are 6 common ones that have been developed over the last 30 years. And I've categorized them here into 3 categories, sensory, conceptual, and symbolic, by the domain with which they most use. So sensory 1 is focusing on what you can observe outside. It's excellent for modeling things that involve a lot of non-verbal behavior. It's also very good for modeling where you don't have access to your exemplar, so you can't interview them, but you can see what they do. So there are ways of doing this, and these are different ways of doing it. Conceptual modeling, that's more useful for the more kind of analytical style of modeling, where you might want to model someone's thought processes and the structures. That's been used to model people like Walt Disney for the creativity strategy by Robert Dilts, and the like. I won't go into all of this, it's a big long program. And then symbolic modeling, or metaphoric modeling, which is making use of the naturally generated metaphors that people use. And I'm going to go on and say about that, because I know some of you come here specifically about modeling. Metaphors. There's a lot of words on this, but what I want to get you to realize from this is, what Penny and I did is we looked at really these great modelers that are on the other page, and we asked, okay, so how do you do that? Let's apply the process to itself. And what we found is that they take a very different perspective on the process. So I'll give you some examples. So unconscious uptake. This is a very interesting process developed by John Grinder and some of his colleagues, whereby you attempt to acquire the skills of the other person non-consciously. Completely different to the way we try to acquire information at school. but you are attempting in many ways to switch off your conscious mind and to get the information and to your unconscious until such times that you can do the behaviors, and then you can try and figure out from yourself how you do it. An alternative one, we take here, take on, this is where you describe the way you do it and I try to take it on. So I say to you, okay, what do you do when you walk into that room in that house? What's the first thing you do? Well, I look around the room. Okay, how do you look around the room? What kind of look around? Well, I'm kind of scanning the horizon because I know there are these bombs around. Oh, okay, so how are you scanning? Well, my eyes go like this and I'm looking and I'm thinking, I'm looking at the people and their reaction to me. So now I'm taking on, okay, I'm going to do the scanning, looking at the people. I'm trying to be this person. I'm taking on his internal world. That's me taking it on. And then the other one here is this facilitating through self-modeling, and that's what I'm going to demonstrate later. So I won't say any more about it, you'll see it happening. Right, let's talk about metaphor. This is such a fascinating area. When I was in business and I managed big projects, I was a project manager, big multi-hundred-million-pound projects. If you'd have come to me and you'd have asked me, what's a metaphor? I'd have said, it's those things that people use when they don't know how to talk properly. That's what I'd have said, and that's supposed to, most of my engineers would have said the same. But that was a long time ago, before academics actually started doing something interesting, which is recording ordinary people and finding out how many metaphors they used. And what they discovered was, and this figure will probably shock you if you haven't heard of it before, all of us, often in ordinary conversation will use 4 to 6 metaphors a minute. Now, given that you probably are surprised by that figure, what it means is most of them you don't know you're using. And what's more, the person who's listening to you don't know you're using. But in order to understand you, they have to take on the metaphor. If I say that, for me, when I'm doing a modeling interview, for me, it's like being a blind surfer. It's like I'm on a surfboard, but I'm blind, I can't see where I'm going, and I'm having to go side to side and to stay with the wave, and the wave is the way the person's going. So that gives you a small insight what it's like for me as a modeler. You have to take on those metaphors and put them through your system and run through all your neurology, what's surfing about, what's blind about, what's going with the waves, all these things, you know what these are, and somehow you're making sense of it by taking on. Afterwards, your analytical mind might go, oh, that's rubbish. But it can't do it until you've already taken them on. So, what the scientists have discovered, people like George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, is that, whoops, wrong way, please go back, is that metaphor is central not just to the way we think, but the decisions we take, the way we make sense of the world. I can give you dozens of academic references and experiments that show how deeply embedded that is. And metaphors are embodied. What that means is that we actually use our understanding of our body and the way that we interact with the world to make sense of anything that's more complex. So I gave you a metaphor of surfing. You know how surfing works, you know about balance, because you learn to walk through balance. So your body knows about balance, not just your mind. You learn about balance when you were this high. So when I talk about surfing and I just do this, at some level you've seen me, on some level you are processing that, and some level the metaphor of balance is translated in what you physically know about balance. And as a result of that, that will inform your understanding and the decisions you make. If only I had time to give you some examples of the brilliant research they've done. So that's what the academics have discovered. What we've discovered through doing this work over the last 20 odd years is that people often start with a common metaphor when they start talking. Oh, I'm going around in circles, my life's at crossroads, these kind of things. But once you start asking these clean language questions, they end up with a very personal, idiosyncratic metaphor. And you'll see that, I think, in a moment. And what's interesting, they last for a very long time. Certainly, we know they last over 20 years. And they are very memorable. So when people work with us, and we work to help them identify their memory, help them to identify their metaphors about who they are, the way they are in the world, in 10 years' time, that's the only thing they'll remember from the session. They may not even remember our name, they'll remember that metaphor. And then this is the whole basis of our work as coaches and as therapists and as consultants, that when metaphor changes, so does the person's view of the world change, and so does their actions. So let's take a common one. Actually, I have to say that I like to, sometimes when I'm working with a group of business people, I like to give them this little problem, a conundrum, which I say to them is, I want you to come up with a metaphor for your business, but it is not allowed to include competition. Okay, you can have any metaphor you want, but it can't have any things that involve competition. So we can't have any races or teams or sports metaphors. Okay, we can't have any war metaphors, because that's a serious competition. Battle metaphors, they're all out. Now, what? And the room goes very quiet. Because competition is a metaphor. It's a metaphor that's pervasive in business, but it's still a metaphor. It's not the only way you think of business. And today there are a whole number of people who run companies now beginning to use different metaphors that are much more organic, much more based on farming, much more based on natural worlds like ecosystems and things like that. If you happen to think that in order for business to succeed and organisation to be profitable, you have to have a competitive edge, you've got to beat the competitors, it's fine, that's a way of operating, very successful. But just imagine for a minute that you thought that business was more like farming. It was about planting seeds. It was about nurturing, and it was about putting the right fertilizer in, and it's about seeing what came up the next year and thinking years ahead and leaving areas fallow. If you adopted that metaphor, my belief is you would operate in a very different way. So change your metaphor, change your worldview, change your behaviour, change your decisions. That's the basic premise. And just to give you some ideas of how common metaphors are, these are metaphors that people will use all the time without necessarily realising that when they say the organisation is rooted in the old thinking, they may see the metaphor of a plant. We reaped enormous benefits. What's reaping? That's a farming metaphor. All of these would come out of people's mouths, and mostly we wouldn't realise it. So, in order to give me time, I want to just briefly say, then, this is what's involved in systemic modelling. It involves these areas. Symbolic modeling, thank you. Symbolic modeling. And it involves these areas, the metaphor, the clean language, which is the questioning process.
You've got all the time you want. It's okay.
You should, I was aiming to finish at 8:30.
You've got all the time you want in the next 15 minutes.
Thank you. And the one I just want to point out to you, which is a really new area, is this is now being used as an academic research process. And producing some really interesting results, because it's possible to study a transcript that's done as an academic interview, a qualitative interview, or a market research interview, for example, and to assess how much did the interviewer put in and how much did the interviewee put in. And because a large amount of our language and our metaphors are unconscious, unless you know you're doing it, you won't know how much you're influencing. So that's an area that I'm very interested in recently. But systemic processes, symbolic modeling, is part of a wider field that we nickname clean, a clean area. And it comes from the work of David Grove, who developed this clean language, which has allowed him to work with the client without putting his own metaphors in, without putting his own assumptions in, and working entirely in their inner world. That's clean languages. Almost all clean processes involve a form of clean language in one form or another. Symbolic modeling is the process that Penny and I have elicited. But there are a whole number of processes now, and they share these principles of clean principles, as we call them. That's our. If any of you come across a thing like agile as a computing process, well, if you think of agile as a computing, clean is the kind of equivalent word we use to one word for our whole field. But it all stems from David Grove. And this is the man himself. He developed clean language. It's an incredibly simple language model. Because people are complex enough, we don't need to add it in. Sadly, David's not with us anymore, otherwise we'd still be modeling. And here was an example. This was someone who was a coaching client who said, I'm at a crossroads in my life. How many times have you heard that? But after a few clean language questions, this crossroads had train tracks, it had an approaching train, he was on one side, there was the approaching train, this was barren on this side, there was lush nature on that side. He had a great desire in his chest to take that small leap over the steps, and then there was danger because the train was coming. And he wanted to do that, but his legs were stuck because of the hands of responsibility that held him back. Now, there's probably nobody else on the planet that has a crossroads quite like that. But that was very real for him. That is as real a description of his internal world and his current situation as you will ever get. You will not get a more accurate representation, and you will not understand another person's inner world easier than in what it is, 20, 30 words than that. So, the reason we work with the individual is because there is no science of the individual. All science is about generalizations, but the generalizations may not apply to an individual. And if any of you have ever had any health challenges, you will know exactly what this means, because you will be told about this is the general, this is the kind of medications that should work. Whether they do for you, whether they work in that way, is completely unpredictable. However, having modelled an individual, then those structures can be usefully applied elsewhere. So it works the other way around. And briefly, this might be useful to some of you. When I'm modelling, well, you have to have some kind of understanding of what is the structure of people. And this is what I think are the most common ways people will go to organise their inner world. The first and foremost is that we actually identify things in our world. We give them names, we give them ideas, we make them a something. So let's take the idea of a business. What is a business? It isn't anything, it's not a thing. But we call it a business, and in our mind we can imagine it as a something. But it isn't a thing, it's an incredible complex thing. That's what we do, we thingify things in our mind. So we have to identify them and give them labels. Ooh, then what we do is we attach qualities to those labels and to those things. We look for the qualities of them. What kind of business is it? It's a growing business. Anything else about the business? Well, it's had some challenges, but it's now got over those challenges and it's growing rapidly. But there's competition. Now we're finding out about the qualities of this business. But nothing exists on its own. It's always in a continuation of time. So how do people put things in order? Whether something comes before, during, or after is absolutely vital to the sense we make of it. As a football fan, it's really important that the footballer, my team, does not take his shirt off and start running around until he's checked with the linesman to see whether he's got his flag up or not. The order makes a lot of difference. This one here is fascinating, relating across space. If you take some time to examine your own inner world, what you'll find is it's remarkably spatial. We put things in different areas, and when we listen to our language, the most common metaphor on the planet is space. Think about all the metaphors for time, all the ways of describing time. We say the deadline is approaching. There's a deadline, it's approaching. I said, using a spatial metaphor, my past is catching up with me. I was beside myself with anger. Those are all spatial metaphors. There are millions of them, not only in English but in every other language. Then the last one on top of this is we hierarchize. We put things into hierarchical levels in order to separate out different levels. That's the basic structures that we can assume. What everybody does is they organize those things uniquely. And then these are the clean language questions that I'm going to ask. They're freely available on the web. And that's enough, I think. But what you'll see from them, very simple. Look at that. What kind of some part of that person's experience? And is there anything else about that part of that person's system? And then what happens? And what happens just before? These are very simple questions. Because as David says, David Grove says, the other person's in world is complex enough. That was a whistle-stop tour through this. Now the most important part, I think, is to have a chance to see it happen. So, let's turn this off. Would you like to tell everybody, if they don't all know you, who you are and what you do?
Okay, so my name is Sean, I'm British, as you can probably get from my accent. I've been living in Paris for nearly 20 years now. And I'm HR director for Read Exhibitions, which is an events group.
Thank you very much for agreeing next. I know you really have no idea what's going to happen
next. I have
next.
no idea, and I hope it's going to work.
And just in terms of that, one thing I want to say about this is every answer you give is perfect. Okay? Whether you say, I don't know, I don't understand, or you come out with 5 minutes worth of answer, they're all perfect. That's the first thing. Now, when we had a chat on the telephone, one of the things that you said was that you felt that you had a particular skill which helped you in your job.
Yeah.
And how would you describe that?
I think, and I'm told, I have a very good skill with empathy and listening.
Empathy and listening. And so it's great that that's what you think you'd be told. Do you have any sort of hard evidence that perhaps you've got a good skill at this?
Okay, so maybe start from when I was a child, I've always been the person that people come to when they have a problem. That's one thing. They still do today.
Okay.
And the second thing, maybe more hard evidence, is I've done several 360s. I don't know, I'm sure you're all familiar with 360s. And the thing that comes out at the top, always in 360s, is that I'm very good at empathy. So everybody, people around me, my team, my peers, my managers, say the same.
So that's good enough for me, because when I want to know if someone's good at empathy, I want the other people to tell me. I've met some people who think they're good at empathy, but they're not. So that's good evidence.
Well, I hope you think
I do already. So let's just start with, when you're being empathic, you're using empathy in your job. Perhaps what would be useful is take an example where, in particular, I know it's something you can use anywhere, but take a particular example. Where would you particularly feel you need to make use of that empathy?
Okay, one example would be I do some recruitment stuff. When I go and collect the person personally to start with, I always think it's important to not to send my assistant down to meet them. Okay. And I try and make them feel welcome and, you know, comfortable.
Okay. So it starts right from not sending your assistant, and you go in and making them feel welcome and comfortable. Yeah. And you think that's important. What's important about that?
Well, it's the image of the company. It's also, I think it's useful in the recruitment process, because when they feel comfortable, they give you more information.
Okay. So it's about them feeling comfortable, so then they can give you more information and the image of the company. Okay. And so you go and welcome them, and then this is a recruitment interview. So what happens? How does that? What happens with your empathy in that recruitment interview?
Well, it starts with obviously I meet them, and we have to go in the lift. It's 5 floors, and in the lift I try and talk to them and just general, you know, conversation about, you know, where did you come from? You know, it's been a difficult trip. The weather's nice today. It's, you know, just general chit chat that you wouldn't expect in that kind of situation.
Okay. So it's the general chit chat that's not the traditional business. Okay, then what happens?
Right up to my office, usually ask them for if they want something to drink, and sit down to start the interview.
Okay. And so what you want is for them to feel comfortable. Is there anything else you want?
Anything else I want?
Yeah.
Obviously I want to get as much information as possible. On lots of different areas, in their job, about who they are.
And in terms of empathy, is there anything else you want from the empathy?
Is there anything else I want from the empathy?
You want them to be comfortable? So I'm just going to comment to them what you think about that. Okay, so all the questions up to now, basic standard questions, the answers come out really easy. Now I've asked the question that's not been asked before, it's not been thought about, so the person has to slow down. They have to go inside, they have to try and think about it, and then, so that's the first one. You see the shift that's happened? My point of view is great. Now we begin to work with some unknown or tacit knowledge, or at least the edges of it.
Maybe it's just something I do generally with people I meet. Not just because it's a recruitment situation, but because it's somebody new and it's a way of meeting them, getting to know them, just generally. Does that answer the question?
So it's a way of getting to know them. Okay. And so what is important about them feeling comfortable?
What's important? It makes me feel good too.
Okay. So you feel good when they are comfortable. Anything else?
It makes the whole situation easier.
Okay. So it makes you feel good, they're comfortable, the whole situation's easier, and you get more information. Anything else?
Yes. I think it's just part, we discussed a little bit over the phone, so I think it's just part of who I am. So it's something I've always done. So it's just kind of a natural process.
So it's a natural process, it's something that you've always done, part of who you are. Anything else about it being part of who you are?
I wonder if it's something I've learned to do or something that is innate. And I actually watch my son. I've got 2 sons, and one of them is much more, very similar. He does in a very similar way to me. Very empathetic, makes friends very easily, and has the same kind of process as me.
The other one?
Not so much.
Not so much.
It's much more.
So it may be innate, and you may learn.
I don't know.
So, and when you're in that recruitment interview and you are being empathic, how do you know that,
How do I know?
that you are being empathic?
Because the person opposite smiles at me.
Okay.
And their general movements, the way they sit, they look comfortable, they don't look tense, the way they talk to me,
So
the answers they give to me.
So the smiling, and the way they look, and the general
The language.
and the language. Anything else that lets you know empathy is happening?
Sometimes the interview drifts off into different areas rather than isn't concerned with the recruitment. So we could talk about, something that they say, they will go into a different subject that has absolutely nothing to do with the recruitment process. Apart from confidence.
Okay, so that's a sign that they're comfortable. And so, is empathy for you something that you have or you don't have, or is it something that you have to a degree that can change with the individual during the interview?
You mean can I change attitude in the interview?
Yeah, let's start with that.
Generally not.
Okay.
On occasions it can happen.
Okay. And so that's one part where you can change that attitude on it. Let's stay with that for a moment. So what kind of attitude is it that you have most of the time in those meetings?
How do I describe it? Difficult. It's difficult to like you said, it's difficult to describe because it just happens. So I think I smile a lot. Now in a recruitment interview, I wouldn't physically touch anybody, but I could give you another example.
But let's stay with this one for the moment. So you're smiling a lot, that's what you do on the outside, and your attitude, what kind of attitude do you have?
I try not to talk too much.
Okay. Anything else?
I look at the person.
What kind of attitude do you have about people who are coming for an interview?
What kind of attitude do I have? Interested in what they are, what they have to say. Interested to see what they've done, because I meet lots of interesting people. People have very different backgrounds. I'm always interested to hear what they have to say to me.
So, this might sound a bit of a funny question, but when you're interested in the other person, how do you know you're interested?
Because I listen intently.
Anything else you do?
I try and find out more, probably. Ask some more questions. And,
okay. So you listen intently, you try to find out more. So that was about your attitude and your interest. The other area then I was asking about was whether empathy is something that you have or you don't have, or whether it can change over time. Perhaps during the interview. And so I was just finding out how you saw empathy. Is it something that you have and that's it? Or does it sometimes have more empathy, less empathy?
I think generally, initially, I always have it.
Okay.
And then I wouldn't say it disappears, but for some people, where there's something that interests me more, then I'll be even more.
Okay. So when you're more interested, then there can be more empathy. And when you're less interested, then what happens?
No, to be honest. Maybe I would ask less questions.
Maybe.
Maybe the interview will be shorter.
How often are you not interested in the person?
Not very often.
No, I didn't think so. But I still want to stay with this idea about whether it changes. So what you've said is it can go up if you're more interested.
Yeah, I think it can.
Is there anything else that influences it?
The person's attitude as well.
How do you know about their attitude? What happens that makes you know about their attitude?
Well, a physical, for instance, if they're smiling. What else? If they're open.
So smiling and open. Anything else? Okay. So their attitude and your interest, and whether they're open, is a fact. It happens as an influence.
Yeah.
Okay. And so we're going to, just for the time's sake, I'm going to come into one piece. Okay. So let's take your interest. Okay. So, so are you interested right now?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, it's fascinating.
So fascinated. So how do you know you're fascinated right now?
Because I want to know what's going to happen at the end,
Okay.
and what I'll find out.
So that's a want to know.
Mm-hmm.
So when you want to know, with this fascination, where is that want to know? Where do you experience that want?
Where inside me?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a difficult question. It's a kind of excited feeling.
Okay. So it's a kind of excited feeling. So what kind of excited is it?
I don't know how to answer that.
Okay. So then what's the feeling like? What's that excited like?
Like happiness.
Like happiness. Anything else about the kind of feeling that it is? So how do you know it's excited and fascinated compared to all the other feelings you have?
How do I know? I don't.
You do, because you
Okay.
just told me you're fascinated.
Okay.
But you don't know how you know.
No.
No, not yet. So if I can just pause again. So this is now, we're really at the area of direct tacit knowledge. If a person makes a definite statement, I'm interested, I'm fascinated, they must know they are at some level. But can we go beyond just that statement? And you think about it, we have hundreds upon hundreds of experiences, we have thousands of feelings and they change all the time. And we, at some level, know when we're having different experiences. How do we know they're changing? My belief is because they each have different characteristics. So the feelings might have, one feeling might have one quality compared to another quality. And I don't want to say what those qualities are, possibly, because I don't want to influence it, but they can have a range of qualities. And as a result, we go, oh, this is happy, this is sad, this is interested, this is bored, this is excited, this is what, da 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 da. So one of the things we're trying to get to is these qualities. Because when a person says, I'm interested, and we think, oh, everybody must be interested in the same way. Believe me, they're not. There are thousands of ways to be interested, and what we're trying to find out is Sian's way of being interested, because what I have discovered is her interest in the person and finding out information from them is paramount to her empathy. Seems to me there's a connection between her amount of interest and the empathy. So therefore what I'm doing now is going into the interest, because that seems in some ways to be related to it. I don't know fully how yet. But how does she do interest and fascination? And how does she want to know what's going on inside her? Because if I'm training someone to be a recruitment person and they think actually most people are boring, they're never going to be able to do an interview like this. If they think, oh, well, most people are not really very interesting, are they? They're never going to be able to do an interview like this unless they have that level of interest and that level of want to know how this turns out. So, are you happy if we carry on trying? And it's okay to say, I don't know. And it's okay to take your time. So anything else about this interest, this fascination that you have with the people you're interviewing? Anything else about the qualities or the characteristics?
Well, while you were talking, I was thinking about it. So, I think there are two cases. One is where, when I'm speaking to somebody and we find some common point of interest.
Okay.
So then the discussion will go a lot further, and it's something that really I'm passionate about or really enjoy. Or sometimes it will be, I will meet somebody in an interview or a similar process who has done something that's sort of completely different from what I've ever done. But that I found passionate and maybe would have liked to do.
So you want to find out about that? Yeah. Okay. So those are two cases. So what's happening in those two cases that let you know you're interested and you want to find out?
I feel physically excited, but I don't know how you explain that.
Okay.
There's some kind of process in.
So one of the things is that as a general rule is the body will tell you the characteristics before the words come. Because we don't have a language, none of us, it's about trying to describe a wine when you don't have a language for wine. Trying to describe internal, but the body knows. Now if you notice the body about interest and excitement, there was this gesture we've seen. So I know that that is a characteristic of her interest and excitement. I don't have words for that, but I know it's a beginning of it. This is a non-verbal metaphor for interest and excitement. So what we would need to do is just say this slowly but surely. It will turn the person plenty of time to get example, to get in touch with their own inner world, maybe take some other examples until at some moment they go, well, you know what, it's actually like ... And I can't say anything that it might be like, certainly not what it's like for me, because I want to hear what it's like for the other person, without them having anything, because otherwise it'd be too easy to grab onto my, oh yeah, it's like that. I don't want to do that. So I don't mind if it takes a little bit of struggle and time and effort. What will come out of it will be valuable and also be really, I think, be interesting for the person themselves. So let's in the time that we've got, let's try a different tack, okay? We'll leave the interest and the excitement for the moment. And just think about the interview, and think about your empathy, which is really what we're looking at here. Think about your empathy during the interview process. Okay. So if you think about, and from the moment when you go and see the people, you go down to meet them and you bring them up in the lift and you chit-chat and then you sit them down and you help them to feel comfortable, and the desire for them to be comfortable and to find out more about them, and the interest in what they do, all of that, when you think about that whole process, that's like what?
Yep.
Makes me feel, just remember what it makes me feel like. It makes, and I don't know if people who are not English speakers will understand this, but it makes me feel warm and fuzzy.
Okay.
Like when I'm watching a sad film. Which is strange, isn't it?
Mm. So it makes you feel warm and fuzzy, like when you're watching a sad film.
Mm.
Anything else that makes you feel like that? Do you keep thinking about it while I ask the group, how many of you guess that's what she's going to say? I'm prepared to bet a lot of money not one of you thought she was going to say it's like watching a sad film. I had no idea. That's an idiosyncratic metaphor. It's unique and personal, but it means something to Sean that it won't mean to any of us yet. So anything else about watching that sad film with that feeling, that warm, fuzzy feeling?
Sometimes it makes me want to actually start my whole life over again and do something completely different. So I have kind of dreams about, you know, what are the words? Is that a good answer?
I can tell you, it's certainly got my interest. And because of the time, I'm going to have to stop it there. But what I just want to point out is, by connecting with that internal metaphor, it's now brought up this other rich information that's about, we've gone much broader now, and we're in an interview 5 minutes, 2 minutes ago. Now we're talking about what I do with my whole life, which is a little bit outside the frame, but that is, I've seen it 100 times. Once a person connects with the metaphor, then they start to make other associations. So this would be the beginning, and a lot of what I was doing in the beginning was leading up to this point, waiting till we had enough information, the person's getting enough connection, that metaphor for the whole process came out, and now we could start and get much more information about watching the sad film and the warm, fuzzy feeling. So it's really the beginning now of that whole exploration of that metaphor, but we don't have time. So what I would like to just finally give you a chance to do, I've asked all the questions about that, I'm going to ask you one last question. Would you like to say to the people watching what it was like to be asked those questions? What it was like from the inside being asked those questions?
Fun.
Okay.
A little bit difficult to answer some of the questions.
Yeah.
Because it's not something you think about every day. Felt good.
Okay. And is there anything you now know about yourself and the way you do empathy that you didn't know 20 minutes ago? Or that you know more clearly, or something like that?
Yeah, I never thought about the way it made me feel personally.
Okay.
That's new.
Okay. So my understanding is that the way these kind of things make you feel there's a huge motivational aspect where we feel is a big, big motivator. So that's probably part of the motivation for being empathetic, as well as other things about knowing each person to make them comfortable and wanting the organisation, the image of the organisation, and all of those other things. But that will be a big personal motivator. So I'm going to say thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Looks very easy. Does take a bit of training. So, yeah, if there are any questions about any of that, now's a good time.
Question: is it working for champions, tennis champions, or yes,
yeah,
football players?
So does this process work for sports players and sports men and women? That's a very interesting question, and it's definitely being used. I know people who coached the British dragon boat racing team. You know, dragon boat, that's that great big long thing where they all do this. I know someone who's coaching a professional tennis player at the moment. It's also being used with someone who's in the top 5 of the British kayaking team or the British kayaking system, whatever it is. Because, I mean, it's a long time ago that the book, The Inner Game of Tennis, became popular. But what that basically said is what you do on the inside is just as important. And it is so clearly obvious that even the best players at the critical moments can wobble. And you may have come across this expression that's called mental resilience. And if you've watched the French tennis open and you think about them hitting the balls at you, if you do not have mental resilience, it's stunning what they, for hours upon hours. So those are the kinds of areas where it's being developed in confidence, in mental resilience. And there's one area where it's being used, which is really interesting, is in supporting people to recover from training sessions. And that's been done as a scientific experiment where they are measuring the amount of lactic acid in 2 groups. One group that just do their normal recovery and another group that have been facilitated to have metaphors for the cleansing process of the lactic acid, find their own metaphors, and to test, do they have a quicker recovery period? So that's an example which is being used in sports.
I was very much interested by the fact that we saw this word empathy, which is called in NLP, French NLP, nominalisation.
Yeah, nominalisation, yeah, we borrowed it from you.
And you gave flesh by those questions and answers to this word. And I was asking myself, could it be used to talk about the word, for example, in France, there's a word that is much talked about is laïcité. Laïcité in French politics is position against religion.
Okay.
Relationship. And everybody talks about laïcité with other denominations. Could you use it to give flesh to this word?
Yeah, and I don't know that it's ever been done with that word, but I can give you an example where an environmentalist who was involved in a pan-European project that was trying to encourage sustainability. And what he did is he went around and interviewed the people involved in the project from different countries to find out what did sustainability meant. And believe me, even among scientists, they have a very different, not just a definition, I don't mean but their inner sense of what sustainability is, and the metaphors that they had, he found a whole range. And that was really useful because if you put 2 people in the same room and they think they're meaning the same and they're not, the confusion that comes out of that. So it's definitely can be used for that. And what was interesting about that was, of course, it was cross-cultural and cross-linguistic. And metaphors are very interesting about when you look at them across languages. So definitely. Any other questions?
Yes, I would like to know if it's possible to modelize teams.
Teams.
And not only individuals.
It is. I'd say it's an order of magnitude more complicated because of the numbers involved and the systemics of the network effect. But certainly, and the best way to do it that I've seen is rather than do it as an outside here, like I'm doing this here, is to actually teach the team to model themselves, and then they do it as a self-modeling exercise within them. So they ask each other the questions, and out of that they can find metaphors they agree with, metaphors they don't, ways of working, and it's been used also for teams to find joint metaphors. For example, it's one you can have a vision for a company or a team, and you put the words up on the wall, and after a little while those words normally become like wallpaper. But if you get a metaphor for the team, that is their joint vision, for example, you model that out. Where does the team want to go? Or where does the company want to go as a whole? That metaphor sticks. It's a much more memorable metaphor, and it also facilitates a dialogue. You can use it as the basic dialogue about which you have those kind of conversations. So it's certainly, and there are other people doing that. It's not my area of specialism, but there are people, and if you're interested, I can let you know about them afterwards. There was another question, yes, sir?
Yes, about sales effectiveness, sales team effectiveness. There's a lot of literature around how you can change your behavior to get your sales done. And I was just wondering how your approach relates to this behavioral science of what it is to be successful in sales in a particular setting.
Yeah. So, I'm all for supporting people to learn new behaviours, and I think there's some real, if you're going to be a salesperson, you can learn some good phrases and way to articulate, and just learn them. They're really great. You can learn how to dress, you can learn how to stand, all of that. And at some level, if that isn't congruent with what's going on inside, there are many people who will detect it. And that's when you get incongruence, inauthenticity, people don't believe them, and don't trust them, they don't know why. So, for me, if you're going to come across as a genuine person, what happens on the outside needs to reflect what's happening on the inside. So if you change the outside, but you don't change the inside, and to use a metaphor, that can leak and be detected by people at an intuitive level. They might not completely understand why, but they would just have a feeling about another person. So I think the two need to go hand in hand. You need to do the two together.
Isn't there a case that if someone changes the behavior, then their internal experience is going to change, and so they don't have to name what's happening inside of them. They're actually going to be transformed because they're going to spend more time listening.
I agree.
Listening, this is going to transform.
I agree 100%. What happens on the outside affects what happens on the inside. But why stop there? Well, my approach is to go, what happens on the inside will also affect on the outside. So do the two together. We talked about it. It is a systemic process. So if you're changing the inside, it will automatically change the outside without having to go through training and training yourself. But if you change the outside, it will naturally change the inside. The two work hand in hand. So I think the best approach is to do the two in conjunction with each other. One of the ways that when I work as a coach is people try the outside first, and what it does is it brings up the resistances inside, it brings up the blocks, the concerns, the fears, the self-doubts. Then you can work with those directly. When they change, then they will change the way that they sell, the way that they relate to people. So it's often a very useful way of establishing what's happening inside. If they change the outside, the inside change, and it's all fine, great.
One last question. Got one? While you are thinking of the question, James wrote a lot of amazing articles on which are available freely on the website, which is cleanlanguage.co.uk, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we will put it in the PowerPoint as it was the first presentation, but if you want to ask more personal and direct question, I would propose to have a drink outside, and I would like to thank James and Dave to be here.